Welcome to the Leadmore podcast. I'm your host, John T. Meyer. The Leadmore podcast is the show where we sit down with leaders of the past and the present to help inspire and create more leaders for tomorrow. I believe the world needs more leaders, and I want you to be the next one. So are you ready? In episode 29, I sat down with Benya Kraus, an incredible young leader. She's the co-founder of Lead for America. Lead for America has a fellowship, coaching and training programs, and they inspire and connect people to come back home to wherever they're from in America, generally rural America, to create impact and change. Benya grew up both in Bangkok as well as rural Minnesota, Waseca, Minnesota. So she'll explain that story of how that shaped her and how she realized there was good and change to be done back home. You'll learn about how she met her co-founders in a very serendipitous way and what she thinks leaders need to learn for the future, what leadership is going to look like. I can tell you that after this conversation, I'm more inspired and more hopeful for what the next generation of leadership looks like. These guys are helping create it. So you're gonna love this episode. Let's dig in. Benya Kraus. All right, welcome everybody to another edition of the Leadmore podcast. I'm super excited today to meet someone for the first time today, and I know we're gonna have lots to talk about. Her name is Benya Kraus, and she's the co-founder of Lead for America. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Good to be
and tell
with you.
Tell everyone where you're calling from, because we were talking about that just before we clicked record.
Yeah, I am calling from the grand lands of Waseca, Minnesota, rural community about 10,000, an hour and a half or so south of the Twin Cities. Yeah.
You're there because you said it's a family farm. It's where you grew up, right?
Yeah. Well, so home's a little bit complicated for me personally, but or it's just mixed around. But my dad grew up as one of 9 on our family farm, and it's, still in operation. Now my cousins are taking it over in the 6th generation, but I was born in Bangkok. And so my mom actually also grew up in agriculture. Her dad was the dean of the agricultural school in Chiang Mai, so northern Thailand. Yeah. So
it's a very different part of agriculture, but still yet, roots in agriculture. That's cool.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know how God made it happen, but they ended up meeting in Thailand, got married at Sacred Heart Church in Waseca, and then had me and my brother out in Bangkok. So when you have 53 first cousins, every summer and winter is back in Waseca. So
tell me, just to understand kind of your origin, how long did you grow up? How many years did you spend in Bangkok?
Yeah, so I was born there, and my dad worked for the UN, so we traveled a bunch, but he was working on global health work. So we did a stint in the Northeast for my elementary, middle school, and then I came back to high school in Thailand, and then went up to university out in Boston, did some time in North Carolina, all to really find my way back to Minnesota. So
yeah, that's great. So I have to ask, how many languages do you speak?
So English, Thai, although I will say I'm illiterate. I know how to write my name and the word chicken, and that's it, but I can speak and understand it, and studied Spanish and a brief stint of French. So I can pretend like I have the accent, but I don't.
Well, I always admire, we've had a professor at Augustana University, which is a school here in Sioux Falls, and he kind of had a similar response. He's like, what he feels like comfortable reading in versus how many speaking in. Like speaking, dozens he felt like, but like reading was a little different. I just feel like it's a skill that people either sometimes have or they don't. If they have it, they can really adopt. And I'm sure that growing up in a home where I'm guessing both languages were quite prevalent all around you, right?
Yeah. Although I will say my mom taught me, I learned how to speak Thai by speaking to my mom, but with the Thai language, you speak to your elders very differently than when you speak to someone your age or younger. So I'm just perpetually stuck with like the language of speaking to an elder. So even very now formal. That I'm of an age where there's people who are younger, I'm still talking to them like they're my mom. So
so they give you some looks then when they're very formal and respectful, I'm sure.
Yeah. So I'm working on my slang on that.
Cool. Well, let's jump forward. We'll get to Lead for America here in a bit, but you're going to school in Boston. What were you going to study there at Tufts? Or what were you planning?
International relations. Yeah. Okay. So I majored in IR with with minors in urban studies and colonialism studies.
Okay. And so you lived across, parts of the world and America. Did you have an idea of what you wanted to do, or what was your plan?
Oh yeah. I grew up and was such a planner. And so I went to test with the plan that I was going to be moving every 2 to 3 years in these big cosmopolitan cities. A lot of my internships were, at the global level. And I thought, if I wanted to make the biggest impact I could for society, it seemed natural that I would try and do it at the biggest level possible, which seemed to be global. So I kind of carried that with me, which is, a little ironic when you think of the work that I'm doing now.
Yeah. That's funny. Okay. And so you have this plan, and you're going to execute the plan. But as we said right before we clicked record, you had this idea, or you met these co-founders who had this idea. Let's talk about that origin because leaders often starts with just a little kernel or a little light bulb moment. So talk us through how it became a reality.
Yeah, so I had this whole plan of working globally really until my junior year of college, and a tough family situation actually brought me to Wasika for a summer. So I kind of diverted a DC internship to spend a few weeks in Wasika. And, the thing about Wasika is that I think Google has these headlines, or what you search on Google is a very different narrative than the Wasika that I've now come to know. So there's, always nuggets of truth to these headlines, but it's not the whole story. So if you are to ask Google, if you were to ask even sometimes Wasika residents to share, what is our community, they'll talk about in the 90s, our U of M campus closing and turning into a federal penitentiary. They'll talk about how at one time we had the largest number of engineers per capita in the entire country, because we had, a strong radio and print business. And so we had a lot of radio and audio engineers. And mechanical engineers. But when those industries changed globally, nationally, it also closed down several of our key industries. So there's actually, a building that is still vacant after multiple rounds of trying to, start kind of our traditional manufacturing back up.
So sorry to interrupt you, but what's the population today, and maybe what was it at its peak?
Yeah, it's about 10,000, and it's kind of really hovered at that, and sometimes gone down. It's hovered at that for several decades.
Okay. But it sounds like the structure, or the way the community looks and feels has evolved.
Yeah, and I think there's like a lot of rural communities, a challenge of we do need to grow, and having a leveled population like that, I think if you don't think of ways to keep and attract, but also, both retain and attract new community members, you're going to start to see those numbers go down. And,
Sure.
Even the people who might be living in Wasika don't work in Wasika, or, that pull, I think, to go elsewhere, may be strong if we don't, think about what's our strategy to recruit and retain. So,
yeah. So you had that idea, and maybe you started to recognize this trend when you were home that summer.
Yeah. Well, so, when I was home that summer, I got introduced to these new immigrant entrepreneurs that were just starting businesses, and now we're in many ways like the life of our main street. And that was also the time when we did have we conducted a Vision 2030 process, and there were these really big, bold claims of where we needed to go as a community. And at the heart of that was, we can't get to all of these things if we don't find a way to attract and retain our young people. Mm-hmm. So I think that, coupled also with the deeply personal and relational, it was a tough time for my family, and I just saw people come out of the woodworks of people who, our mail lady, who knew I had been collecting stamps since a little girl, but I hadn't come back to Wasika in a few years. She had actually been saving all of the stamps that, from the mail that she couldn't deliver. She would save those stamps, I suppose, waiting for me that one day I would come back and that she'd be able to give them to me. And she did that summer. And I was just struck, I think, with that story in particular, because at that time I was living in a triple decker in Boston, where honestly I didn't know who my neighbors on top or below me were. And here I was, with no reason, people stepped up and cared for our family in such profound ways that summer. and so I was hooked really on both this idea of public service and neighborhood connection, and also rural America. And I went back to Tufts my senior year, just gung-ho on wanting to try and find some way to, before my senior year, I ended up actually taking a local government internship in Minneapolis. So I got to understand a little bit of what you could do in a municipality and really at the local level. Came back my senior year and wanted to do all those things in Minnesota, but like probably many seniors, saw that by, the first month coming back to campus, the recruitment infrastructure to places in Boston, New York, and DC were just so robust, and the narrative around seeing your peers who, maybe weren't actually super attracted to certain career fields, consulting, finance, that kind of industry, found themselves in it without necessarily a natural or, intentional choice to do that. But, and also that they, weren't super connected about.
Yeah, you just described me to a T, right? So like, I didn't grow up in rural America, but growing up in Brookings, about 20,000 people, you have grows during the school year with SDSU. But yeah, senior year of college, communication major, no idea what I want to do, know what I'm good at, but not sure what that looks like in a job title. And at a smaller school like Luther College, they bring these career fairs, and they come and hang their little shingle and their little table, and then the career counselors sort of nudge you like, hey, you have a good GPA or you're interested in technology, you should consider this. And really my goal was, being a lifelong South Dakotan, was like, I want to go to Minneapolis, and I want to like kind of experience the city and go to concerts and sports events. And so this job, 3 rounds of interviewing, and I got a job as a consultant in Minneapolis and moved to the Twin Cities, more so because of where I wanted to be versus what I even knew I wanted to do, right? It was like the peer group was moving there, and it was sort of kind of the next natural step. So yeah, I totally buy what you're selling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I fell into that myself too. I was heavily recruited by a corporate law firm out in Boston that fall semester of my senior year. And I think I fell into that bucket of ambitious undergrads who were like, if I don't have a job by mid-October, this degree is worthless. So, and when you look at the public service route, no one is recruited. You go to career fairs for public service.
They're not thinking about that.
Yeah, they're not thinking about that at all. So I was actually signed up to, do this 2-year sort of fellowship program at a corporate law firm out in Boston. And when I had signed the dotted line, I think, forces in the universe were saying, maybe this isn't the most aligned to what you want to do. And at the time, our CEO, Joe, as well as was working on a 1-pager that was Lead for America. And it was this concept of a 2-year paid fellowship program that would bring recent college grads back to their hometowns. And he had a mutual friend with me who shared me that 2-pager, kind of like tongue in cheek of like, I can't believe, are you sure you really want to do this? You could do this instead. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. This is literally what would have gotten me back to Waseca. So, we ended up connecting virtually, looped in a few other, our CEO, Reed, also one of our co-founders. Joe found him because he wrote this like scathing op-ed in the Harvard Crimson saying, so many of y'all wrote personal essays saying, why you wanted this degree to bring it back to your hometowns, or saying you've done public service internships, and then like 90% of y'all are taking jobs in finance or consulting and in a handful of cities. So
interesting. So, because you made that comment right before we clicked record that you didn't know them. So this is your senior year. Through these sort of little kind of crazy moments of enlightenment, you connected and realized you all had a passion for this problem.
Yeah. And all of us too are from like quote unquote flyover states. So, whether it's my best friend who also came on as one of our co-founders too, she's from a small town in Northern California, Joe from Kansas, Reed from Oklahoma, and myself from Minnesota. So,
cool.
We all have our personal convictions and stories of home. And then when you systematize that, right, like when you zoom out a little bit, our stories are not unique because 2/3 of college educated millennials live in just 50 cities alone.
Wow.
Yeah, a
50 cities,
wild
wow.
stat.
So tell me when, maybe it was that summer, and I guess you didn't spend your whole childhood in Waseca, as we've already discussed, but I certainly admit that I grew up with that plan to get out of South Dakota, right? Once I could. I didn't get to choose to grow up there. You sort of kind of, what's the word? Like, trash isn't the right word. I was really appreciative for my upbringing in my community, but it certainly was going to be a step along in the journey. But then something happens around college, or shortly maybe in your mid-20s, where you start to appreciate a lot of those things, like your story with the post woman, and you're like, wait a minute, like, going back home is a really good place. So I think you always would hear in South Dakota, like, well, it's a great place to raise a family, right? It's a great place to come back and raise a family, but I'm not going to be here in my 20s. So when did you have this change of heart, or like, can you pinpoint that, or is it more of a gradual thing that happened over time?
I mean, I do think that summer spent there was very eye-opening for me. And then I think once I had that experience, it magnified, because I then came back to college and realized that, the way people thought of places like Waseca, again, there's some nuggets of truth, but it's not the whole truth. And I just felt very not seen, and I suppose maybe defensive, because they didn't know Julie, the mail lady. They didn't know the 6 generations of history and like land stewardship that my family has been a part of. And I think we, as a national society, are so quick to just put national headlines onto these large swaths of the country without really paying attention to, the nuance, the stories of people, the histories of their place, and how that then informs the history of its people, and the future of its people. So I was frustrated by how can we move together as a country if we are first and foremost not proximate to each other? And, we're not proximate to each other in virtual settings, and we definitely are geographically and physically not proximate to another. And it makes me worried about, that 2/3 statistic makes me absolutely worried about the future of our economy, but also the future of our democracy. If we are not able to see each other, how can we work together on something as important as being a nation collectively together?
That's a great line. I like that. So we talked about that origin. So you guys all joined forces with this passion, and in 2018 start Lead for America. So tell us, give us the elevator pitch of the organization.
Yeah. So, I mean, at our most base level, our mission is to ensure that our most diverse and dynamic young people are working on their community's toughest challenges, especially in places, right, where the narrative of success might mean leaving and not coming back.
Okay.
Yeah. So we know it's going to take a large scale, like, narrative change movement, resources that are being leveraged, and pathways to get young people to see opportunities in these places. But we began first with our flywheel. We call it flywheel, as we think a lot of things span from it, but a 2-year paid fellowship that brings recent college grads back to their hometowns, regions, or states to work on public challenges. And they are challenges that can either be, spearheaded by a fellow. So we have an applicant-led process, and that's actually how we began our start. But then also communities can post out a grand challenge of something really creative that, often isn't on Indeed, because it involves a lot of we ask them to say, hey, if you had a magic wand to significantly transform your community, what would that be? And then we kind of do this matchmaking process and geo-target our recruitment pitch to find people who fit that connection, both for immediately, in the past, and long term too.
Got it. And so it's a paid fellowship, which is being funded by you guys, Lead for America?
Yeah. And here in Minnesota, so part of the evolution of this. We first began our organization in North Carolina, and then I had a seed grant from the Bush Foundation to be able to bring our national model to Minnesota. So here in Minnesota, we're also an AmeriCorps program. So we go off of that AmeriCorps base rate, but then also to make it as inclusive and equitable as it can be, also supplement that with a housing stipend and financial aid to make sure that finances is not the reason why or why not you could come back.
Great. Yeah. And of course we had Jen Ford-Reedy here on the show, and this is like just a perfect example of something that they would want to support. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So tell me, let's talk about an example of what a student or a fellow, I should say, would do. So they apply and go back to their home. How do they create change in 2 years, or what does a project look like?
Yeah. So I'll share some stories because it is really so open-ended, and like rural America, the canvas for creativity, I think, in rural spaces is huge. So we had a lot of projects where fellows would propose things, or we'd find, and by find, I mean, like, I would live on the couch of some of these local change makers in rural communities and get to know them over a glass of wine of like, what is their wild idea for change? Yeah. And then that's what we'd pitch. But some examples of that, we have, we have Evan Bonsall, who came back to his hometown of Marquette, Michigan, and he's working with the county local government there on brownfield redevelopment work. So a lot of around housing and whatnot, but he also was instrumental in building out this grant opportunity to have Marquette be a space station as well. So a national space station. So that was some of his work there. And then while he was there, also ended up running and becoming the first ever elected city commissioner, the youngest ever elected city commissioner for Marquette. Yeah. Wow.
So during that 2-year time, that's what he did. And then obviously still lives in the community.
Yeah. And it's not even been 2 years yet. So it's like a year and a half, but he's bought a house and is getting married to his middle school sweetheart. So I'm pretty sure he's long-term invested.
Oh, that's great. So I see your little map here on the website. You got these dots all over the country. How many states do you have fellows placed in right now? You have 93 fellows in 81 communities. How many states does that span for you?
Yeah, 24.
Cool. Very cool. And I would imagine, is home considered, is it generally all rural, or do you have people also going back home to an urban community? Yeah,
it's mixed. So, especially if it's urban too, we do look for, a lot of the urban settings are places where they pick specific neighborhoods as well. So it's oftentimes like pretty economically distressed urban neighborhoods that aren't often always seen in the work of city planning. So, so it can be, home is described pretty broadly. So sure. It's both rural. It's in Minnesota, it's mostly rural. I think about 88%, of our placements are rural.
Cool. So what I want to transition to next is this idea on your website of convergent leadership. So I'm curious, some of these people obviously express an interest to be change makers and apply, or maybe you sort of find them out and nudge them to apply. What does Lead for America do in terms of setting them up to become, or, continue further their leadership journey? Because they're obviously pretty young in terms of their growth and development. So talk about that. What does convergent leadership mean to your organization?
Yeah. So convergent leadership is a term that, we've constructed, but I will say right off the bat, the lineage of inspiration runs deep. And actually a lot of it comes from indigenous ways of thinking and knowing, and the cyclical nature of leadership too. So convergent leadership, right, is trying to get at this piece that, a lot of the qualities of leadership are best when they are in balance or in convergence with one another. So our model asks us to lean into the convergence of our 4 core pillars, which are foresight, which is linked up and in both tension and complement to justice. It's on the other end too, is then the other 2 pillars are linking up innovation with service. And so when you dive deeper into that, we define each pillar kind of with 3 nodes where I'm using a lot of my hands because it's a very visual example.
Yeah, there's a framework here. Yeah, we can share it.
Yeah.
Yep.
We root each one of these pillars as well with a central node. So when we think of justice, it's first and foremost rooted in a deep, deep, unconditional love. So what does justice work look like? That is rooted in love, both for neighbor, enemy, people who think like you, people who don't. On the other end, so it's held also in complement to foresight. So being first and foremost historically informed, presently grounded, and then working towards a conceptualized future. And then, I think also an interesting tension there is thinking of innovation and service. So thinking of service as to be of service to your community, you first must be proximate, first and foremost proximate. And then with innovation of coming from a place of at the root curiosity. And the magic happens when you are at that place of convergence, when you're doing work on yourself and in your community, and putting that into practice with moving towards a conceptualized view of what is the possibility and breathing possibility into your places and in people around you.
Love that. And so during my fellowship, is there programming or education around these topics that you guys are supporting them in their development?
Oh yeah. We begin the fellowship with a month-long institute where fellows are living and learning together. So what in the midst of if we weren't in COVID, we had planned, a week where we were with our partners out in Boston with hosted at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University, so my alma mater, with also faculty from the Harvard Kennedy School. And then the 3 weeks, at least for the Minnesota fellows, would be actually being in a bus and staying each week in a different part of the state. So we were working with the faculty from the University of Minnesota, so it would bring them both to a rural, a tribal, and an urban setting to understand these practices of local change making from people who are doing it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And so then, even from Lemonly, we've done a lot of this design work around impact when it comes to some nonprofit clients. And that's sort of the word everyone wants to talk about is how do we measure impact? And so I don't know if anybody has anybody completed their fellowship yet? Are people just wrapping the first class or?
Yeah, our first cohort will be graduating in about 6 months.
Very cool. And so that could be a future answer then if you're not sure yet, but how do we measure the efficacy and build upon this so that each cohort you can, in theory, go deeper and create more change?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I get that question of how do we measure impact quite a lot. So, I said that we run a fellowship, but I think it's more apt to characterize it as we run in an alumni organization. So putting a lot of both resources and intention in thinking of how are we measuring their contributions post-fellowship as well. There's a lot that we're even in the past year and a half have been able to measure in terms of their impact while in the fellowship. So, there's been over like $15 million raised or brought into the communities based on, fellows being there and whatnot. But I think the most, one thing too is that we also measure for geographic retention. So we actually ask fellows to commit to 4 out of the next 7 years being invested in their community. So 2 are with us, and then the other 2, they have to figure out what it is that they want to build. So a lot of our fellowship support, so beyond that month-long institute, we do quarterly retreats, one-on-one phone calls, pod groups, connecting them with mentors, and always asking every quarter with both their host and them of how are we going to plant the seed for you to stay here. So is it going to be build out Lemonly in your hometown or start a nonprofit? We have, quite a few examples of ways that fellows have multiplied themselves as well. So actually recruited additional young people to move to their communities or activated volunteer groups and worked with high school students or launching internship programs in Great Barrington, Massachusetts for, people who have gone off to college, but now, without kind of a lead back into their community at some point, wouldn't see necessarily the opportunity that's there. So
yeah. And I want to be fair because it isn't fair to sort of quantify impact even at the end of 2 years, right? You guys are putting these seeds in the ground that are hoping for decades long, return. on your investment. I mean, I think about, we talked offline before about how I moved back with a $15,000 economic development grant to start a company, and that company became 2 companies, and those 2 companies employ about 40 people. So that turned out to be pretty good ROI on $15,000. But that also took a decade almost, so it was very much gradual. It certainly wasn't overnight, but you guys are making all those little bets, that who knows what your fellows will create.
Yeah. And I think too, when I, even if you are a leader nationally or wherever you are, I think having an experience where you are proximate to a local community and where you have experienced like fully what it is like to be cared for by your neighbors and to be really invested in the future of a place. I think, and doing that in your formative years too, I think brings a lot more of a rootedness to your leadership wherever you do end up going. And of course, we would love it to be, rooted in the places that you're serving. But I think that piece of proximity to people and place and understanding the importance of those things is a lot of the type of leadership I would love to see and am drawn to nationally and globally too.
Yeah, that made me think our very first episode in June was with former South Dakota Governor Dennis Dugard, and we talked about crisis, because that was still, we still are in a crisis, but that was in the heart of the early days of the COVID pandemic, and he just shared about the importance of being on site, right? So a rough tornado happened during his administration. You got to go there. You got to talk to the people. You got to look them in the eye. You got to experience what they're trying to feel, and that made me think about what you were saying, which also made me want to ask you, how do we do that? You use that word proximate in what has slowly become just this virtual Zoom world that we all live in, right? Like COVID, for better or not, has seemed to make its way into almost every single episode of the show because it's just so consuming. So what does that look like in your efforts in 2020? Something certainly you weren't preparing for.
Yeah. Especially because, the first quarter assignment for all fellows is to do a listening tour. So, we set even a quantitative target for them to hit. Almost all of them have exceeded the number of people. We said 50 in your first quarter, and a lot of them gone beyond. But it begs the question of how do you do a listening tour and have really deep, intentional conversations that aren't necessarily with a here's what we need to achieve by the end of it, but really trying to get to know that person and what gifts they have, and I like framing it as, your assignment to, for lack of a better word, is to go into every conversation seeking something to cherish about that person. And if you can do that, then that's a successful listening tour. It's hard how to do that on Zoom, totally.
Sure.
But, they've done it. It's either been on Zoom or doing something, volunteering with somebody, going on walks, planting something with a neighbor. And so it's cool to see how they've gotten creative with that. And for many of them, we did one site visit with a fellow here in Southern Minnesota, and he was giving us a tour of some of the hole in the wall Main Street buildings. And there was one that he just knew the code to because he, meets social distancing with this guy for 2.5 hours every Thursday. And we were going through this really kooky place, and I had so many questions, and he goes, you know what? Let me just call this guy and see if he'll come. And within 5 minutes, he showed up. And so I guess to go back to our conversation about impact metrics, I would love to see, I would love to write an impact report where we ask fellows, if you called somebody, how many people would arrive in 5 minutes upon phone call? And that's, I think the way that we measure this listening tour piece, but they've been able to do it. And I think if we weren't in a pandemic, probably it would be done easier, but I think that kind of shows some of the resilience and eagerness.
Yeah, absolutely.
To be connected.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And who knows how that'll force them, that adaptation to grow, and when we can be back to normal of hugs and handshakes, and there's some skills to be gained in that too. So what I wanted to ask you if somebody, I know you guys are targeting folks probably leaving their college experience, but whether maybe someone who's in high school and in growing up in Waseca or Brookings and thinking about what they're going to do next, what would you say to someone listening in that sort of, they're not sure where their path's going to take. They have an appreciation for home, but maybe don't see themselves ever coming back.
Yeah. Well, I think there's something to be said of like when you leave, there's a renewed curiosity then for when you come back, and then sometimes what you have been able to gain from a different setting, both in terms of like intercultural knowledge or a technical skill set. I think it's empowering to know that there's now something that you can give. And I think we become more invested into places that perhaps we would write off if we don't realize that there's a really beautiful gift that we could offer and be of service to a place. I think you can actually start practicing that, and like schools and adults can help model that and encourage that in their young people, so that, I don't think you have to go, somewhere else or that it's a later in life thing. Like, I think we can activate that at the high school level, but I think, or, even earlier, but I think so often, I speak to a lot of young people in high school and middle school, and I think sometimes there's a culture of like the adults got it, or like, they're, and I think I think we're doing a disservice to our kids if we say we got it, because then you become an adult and you're like, oh my gosh, these adults did not get it. And I don't totally get it, So I think being able to paint the challenge and have young people understand the challenges of where you are and value what they have to say and trust them and give them power to start making some changes, or to think of their gifts in a way that can be channeled and appreciated by your community. I think that's a way, to have people graduate and not feel like there's nothing to do here and there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah, that's good. Because you touched on it there, but I wanted to ask you, do you feel like sort of in that hero's journey or in a leadership development, do you need to go away to fully appreciate and make more impact to come home? I mean, especially if you grow up in a Waseca or a Brookings, right? The exposure to some of that diversity of thought or ideas may be more limited. I'm curious what you think on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it is a gift to go out and realize, or cultivate and invest in yourself so that you can channel that to a greater purpose. So I think there's an element, of being able to leave and then come back. But I think, what I worry about is that both in like elementary, middle, and high school, we're not maybe letting our kids grow to see both what their gifts are and what the needs and the hard parts are around them. And then we have them go off to college where, or, whether they go off to college or not, but I think particularly in college settings, you can have a type of experience that opens you up to how you can serve, or you can continue kind of on a traditional education path that is, how do I get more for myself, or how do I move forward in this ladder of success, which often means attaining more either degrees or paycheck levels or things, honestly, that just look good, and falling into this like ladder of success that is not internally motivated but externally dictated by the things we see on Instagram and whatnot.
Absolutely. So, I think Naval Ravikant, who's a venture capitalist and sort of philosopher, I guess, on Twitter, talks about once you realize that it's the game of life, and once to win the game is to actually not play the game, right? Is to sort of recognize that there is the game, and that this ladder of success or the next thing isn't actually what brings maybe happiness or joy, right? It's something that we all kind of get told that we should play.
Yeah. And I think people come into, you said the word hero's journey. Everyone has their own different timeline. And, I moved back to Wasika when I was 24, I guess. And I know a lot of 24-year-olds who wouldn't want to do that at this point.
Sure.
But, I had a set of experiences. And for me, I felt like to be the fullest of who I could be, I needed to root it into a place that I could care about that was more than myself. So, and I came into that at 24. Sometimes people will come into that earlier or later.
Or later, yeah. Well, I want to finish by asking you, and then we'll do some rapid fires. What is this? You guys are very intentional, clearly, about the vision, the impact, how this is building. What does this look like in 10 years, let's say? What's the goal for Lead for America when I call you back in 10 years to talk again?
Yeah. Oh, I love this question. Well, in 10 years, we think of our work or the interventions that are needed to kind of fuel this movement of, and I'll say homecoming, as not necessarily coming home to a place where you were born and raised, but this idea of wanting to be part and create home. And to me, that is about freeing ourselves to be committed to place and to people. So this movement of homecoming, I think the work that we want to be channeling, I think, we can divide into three kind of key categories. Like one, the pathways piece. So making very clear the multiple pathways that can exist for you to come back home. And that could look like, yes, we hope to be able to reach a tipping point in terms of like having the number of fellows and state affiliates that are able to articulate this fellowship pathway back. But also, I think part of that pathway is that EDA investment that brought you back, John. And I think a lot can fall into that pathways piece. I don't think it's just a pathways piece, because I think we also have to start a lot earlier. We've been talking about middle schoolers and high schoolers and college students. I think this ethic of convergent leadership and this framework of seeing possibility in sometimes dreary situations, I think that can be learned, and we need to inject it large scale in our education system. So I'd say that's a second pillar of education. And then the last piece, also thinking of advocacy, national service is such an under-tapped tool, in my opinion. There's a movement of saying, let's make sure that every young person has a year of national service upon graduating from high school. I think that type of large swell and commitment nationally to service allows us, I think, to rebuild an ethic of wanting to know and be proximate to neighbor that I think underlies all of this.
Love that. Yeah. So those are those pillars right on the top of your website here. Yeah, that's great. Cool. Well, thanks, Benya. Let's wrap up with a couple rapid fire just to get to know you a little bit better. I don't know if you're a reader, but what's a book that you recommend to folks if you were to say, hey, here's a great book you should read this holiday season? What's a book that you've read recently?
I'll say two of the
Sure.
ones that I just finished reading. And one is a little biased because I got to interview the author, but Sarah Smarsh just came out with a great book about Dolly Parton. So it's Dolly Parton, She Come By It Natural. Beautiful book about working class feminism and a redefining of rural. So would totally recommend that. And on a fiction side, because this is the first fiction book I've read in a very long time, Transcendent Kingdom by Jan Yassi is another really great recommendation. And as you think about faith, mental health, purpose,
Cool.
and what can be answered by science. So
Sure.
So really great book there.
So maybe, I don't know if it's in Wasika or online or whatever, but I've been asking folks in a stressful 2020, how do you unplug? How do you de-stress this year?
Campfires.
Nice. I love that.
It's giving me,
It's definitely that season right now for sure. Okay, I gave you this as a prep before. What's your superpower? What's the one thing you do better than anyone else?
I've still been thinking about this. I give very good hugs. So that's one.
That's a tough one to have in 2020.
I know. So that's why I was like, gosh, I can't be, like paralyzed superhero.
It's your kryptonite, I guess.
Yeah, I know, it's my kryptonite. What else am I really good at? I keep
I think your
coming
passion
back.
is very clear. I would
Yeah.
definitely say your passion for this. It comes through in our conversation prior and in conversation on this. So, I mean, it takes doing work, like we talked about impact, that the results are measured in decades and not months, like maybe the business world, right? Where it's like the quarterly report and the yearly earnings. That takes passion for sure. And so I definitely admire that. Great work. And then lastly,
I know. Here's my superpower. I am a big basketball player. I love basketball, and I'm very good at boxing out. So like, I'm really good at getting the rebound.
All right. I love it. That's your stat, huh? Boxing out. Mentors or leaders that have shaped who you are today, whether it's folks you know, family members, or folks you've read about, who are the leaders that shape you most?
Yeah. Brian Stevenson is one from the Equal Justice Initiative. We had a chance to visit the Peace and Justice Memorial in Montgomery, and it was extremely powerful. And his ability to be so proximate locally and have that inform, his national fight is very inspiring. So I'd say him.
Very cool. I love it. Well, Benya, this was great. I enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for taking some time, and keep your incredible work up with Lead for America. I'm excited to follow your journey. Thank you.
I appreciate it. And so good talking with you. Thanks for doing what you do.
The last thing I wanted to ask is, if somebody, I'm assuming COVID or not, if somebody wants to get involved in this in terms of like the seasonality, when is the time to apply for a program, or if someone listens to this and says, I want to be involved?
Yeah, applications are out now, and we have 3 cycles. So, just go on to our website, www.lead4america.org. Or if you're a Minnesotan, you could go to leadforminnesota.org, and you can either chart your way back, or we have some pre-confirmed placements as well if you see your hometown there.
Love it. All right. We'll make sure to link that up as well. All right. Thanks, Benya. You take care.
Thank you.
All right, that was episode 29 with Benya Kraus. Wasn't she awesome? Gosh, I enjoyed that conversation, and I hope someone who's listening to this maybe decides to apply to that fellowship or pass the link on to someone who they know. I'd love to see some people like that come back to their homes and create great change. All right, that is episode 29 of the Leadmore podcast. Reminder, you can find all the episodes, all 29 of them, wherever you subscribe to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify. Or you can go to leadmorepodcast.com, where we list them all there. And if you get a chance, go rate us. Give us a 5-star review. You can leave a comment. You can leave a question. We'll find it. Love to hear from what you guys are doing and what you think about the show. All right, that is it. Thank you so much. I'm John T. Meyer. Be well. Happy holidays.